The Piedmont region of North Carolina is home to numerous corporate headquarters, a strong industrial base, a national banking center, prestigious universities, and many beautiful lakes. But this region might look very different if 110 years ago there hadn't been a chance meeting between a man with vision and a man with money. This meeting resulted in the creation of hydroelectric plants that turned the poor Carolina Piedmont into a manufacturing and financial powerhouse. The story starts about 150 years ago as North Carolina began to recover after the Civil War.
You need to remember that the South, after the Civil War and long after the Civil War, was the poorest region in the country by far. And the poorest of the poor was Mississippi. Next to Mississippi was the Carolinas, South and North Carolina. It was on the bottom of the list by a lot of different measurements: education, health care, whatever.
According to statistical abstracts published at the time, 20% of North Carolina's population was illiterate. Kids spent only about 90 days in school a year. Urban areas like Charlotte and Raleigh were a bit more developed, but back then most North Carolinians were poor farmers. A handful of successful Carolinians wanted more for their native states. The least well-known of them all was Dr. Gil Wylie, a native of Chester, South Carolina. After the Civil War, Wylie moved to New York to practice medicine at Bellevue Hospital. Even though he was a physician by training, Dr. Wylie also was a man with vision for economic development. Wylie never forgot the Catawba River that flowed near where he lived as a boy.
It was a free-flowing little river that spilled down rocks and little waterfalls, and it was 10 miles from Charlotte. It was so rocky that there was no point in putting a city on it.
Working in New York at the turn of the century, Wylie probably knew about the massive hydroelectric power project at Niagara Falls. He was probably also using the light bulbs invented by Thomas Edison in 1879. Wylie also probably knew that back home the Catawba River dropped 1,000 feet in elevation as it journeyed from the North Carolina mountains to the South Carolina Sea. While not as impressive or obvious as Niagara Falls, this drop in elevation offered its own opportunities for hydroelectric power. Dr. Wylie and his brothers scraped together all their money, hired an experienced engineer, and built the first hydroelectric plant on the Catawba. That station, called India Hook Shoals, was completed in 1904. Encouraged by the success of India Hook Shoals, Dr. Wylie and Chief Engineer William States Lee sketched out plans for a series of hydroelectric dams scattered up and down the Catawba. But there was one big problem: the cost. Lee figured building this network of dams would cost around $8 million. That's more than $205 million in today's dollars. With no more money to fund his vision, Dr. Wylie returned to New York to practice medicine. Fortunately for history, at that very moment, Dr. Wylie was treating a very rich patient. That patient also came from the Carolinas, and like Wylie, he wanted to help improve his native state. This patient, named James Buchanan Duke, was also one of the richest men in the nation. James Buck Duke, the man who would later endow Duke University, wasn't always wealthy. A biographer wrote that Duke was born on a farm so poor that his family could hardly wring a living from its soil. The family worked hard trying to earn a living growing and drying tobacco.
Now, the Dukes made their money in tobacco. They gambled, on machine-made cigarettes. Buck talked them into doing that, and the family quickly recognized that he was the business genius of the family. And they followed his lead, and they gambled on machine-made cigarettes, and then they made a lot of money.
By the turn of the century, Buck was in his 40s and very rich. He split his time between New York, North Carolina, and London, England, where he oversaw his family's European cigarette business. Buck Duke was a hard man to get a meeting with, but his now infected foot made him a captive audience for his physician. During one of their treatments, Dr. Wylie shared his ideas for hydroelectric power. Buck was intrigued. Wylie summoned engineer Lee to New York to lay out their plans. Years later, Lee would recount that the huge costs never fazed Buck Duke. In fact, Lee said the cost seemed to excite him. That chance meeting sparked the start of what would one day become Duke Energy. In 1907, their first dam began making electricity, and more dams were in the works. Area mill owners had access to clean and cheap energy, but the mill owners weren't buying.
Electricity was new, you see. It had only come in to practical use in the 1890s, and it was still quite new. And there were a lot of people who were scared of it, scared to bring it into their mills, and said it would kill our people.
Having no customers also could have killed the power company's future. Buck Duke's answer was to invest in mills and show owners electricity was safe. It worked. Business was really looking up for hydroelectric power generation in the Carolinas. In July 1916, 11 years after Buck Duke and Gil Wylie's chance meeting, the power company announced plans for a 6th hydroelectric station. No one could have guessed that the hurricane churning in the ocean at that very moment was another turning point. One that could either transform the region's hydroelectric development totally or kill such development altogether. The rain began to fall on Saturday, July 8, 1916. The storm, a Category 4 hurricane, stalled over the Carolinas. Rain poured down, saturating the ground and raising the water table to dangerous levels. By Tuesday, July 11th, the rain finally stopped. The Charlotte Observer reported signs of relief. Few realized another storm was about to hit. 2 days later, on July 13th, another Category 4 hurricane swept in north of Charleston, South Carolina. Tragically, this hurricane also stalled over the Catawba River Valley. The second storm dumped even more water than the first. The Catawba River rose to 47 feet above flood stage. This was twice as deep as any previously recorded flood.
It happened suddenly. The wind blew, the clouds divided and poured torrents. Earth and boulders went tearing down, carrying death and destruction in their wake.
It just generated a wall of water that swept down the Catawba River, wiped out the bridges, wiped out the villages along the river, and really changed people's attitude towards this trickly little stream. All of a sudden, it was an enemy that needed to be tamed.
The floods of 1916 pushed power company engineers to rethink hydroelectric operations. Their answer, a series of dammed reservoirs that would tame the water and let the power company harness the entire Catawba River. With the support of Buck Duke's vast financial resources, the company started building its first reservoir lake the next spring. Over the next 50 years, the power company ultimately created 11 lakes on the Catawba River.
Creating that chain of lakes from Lake James down to Mountain Island and Lake Norman and Lake Wylie and down into South Carolina really transformed the Catawba River Valley. It meant that all of a sudden it was not a wild river anymore.
The lakes have allowed industry to be recruited to the Charlotte area because of sufficient water and inexpensive power production. Without this river, without the lakes, you would not have seen significant growth.
A lot of our banking wealth today comes out of textile mills. The textile mills would not have all clumped here, left New England, if it were not for cheap hydroelectric power. So as we think of our journey from fields to factories to finance, that work of Gil Wylie and James B. Duke at the turn of the century was really a turning point that put Charlotte, the Carolinas, and the South on a new industrial path.
By 1937, the power company was generating 1 billion kilowatts of electricity annually. That year, the Charlotte Observer calculated the value for its readers. To produce this power by steam would require well over 2 million tons of coal, which would have to be imported from other states at a cost of more than $10 million. This money, instead of enriching the mining regions of other states, is building up our own industries in the Carolinas.
We currently have some of the lowest cost energy in the nation. When you're paying 6 cents a kilowatt for power versus 30 cents a kilowatt, you can run a mill much more efficiently and cheaper.
By 1937, the Carolinas were home to the country's largest factories making towels, denim, aluminum, and underwear. Because of hydroelectric energy operations, the Carolinas had risen from positions of mediocrity at the turn of the century to being national leaders in industry and commerce by the 1930s. Even during the Great Depression, 500 new industrial plants opened for business in the Piedmont Carolinas. None of this might have been possible if in 1905 there had not been a chance meeting between Dr. Gil Wylie, the man with ideas, and Buck Duke, the man with the money.